The cruelest thing about losing everything was discovering what still had a price. The morning Clara Bennett sold her mother's ring, she told herself the trembling in her fingers came from the cold. It wasn't cold. The pawn shop on Marrow Street was almost too warm, with an iron stove ticking in the corner and yellow lamplight gathering in dusty circles over shelves of chipped teacups, old pocket watches, cracked picture frames, and wedding silver no one had come back to claim. Outside, late November rain tapped against the windows with the soft persistence of fingernails, but inside, the air smelled of metal polish, cedar drawers, melted wax, and the bitter coffee Jonah Reed had forgotten beside his ledger. Clara stood very still at the counter and tried not to look at the pale mark on her finger where the ring had rested for 12 years. It was a simple ring, silver, narrow, worn smooth at the edges from her mother's hands before it ever became hers. There was nothing grand about it, no jewel bright enough to impress a pack elder, no crest big enough to make an alpha lower his voice. But inside the band, so faint she had only noticed it 3 nights ago by candlelight, was a tiny engraving of a lantern beneath a crescent moon. Her mother had never explained it. Clara had never thought to ask. There were many things daughters believed they would have time to ask their mothers, until time proved itself less generous than love. Jonah Reed picked up the ring with 2 careful fingers and turned it beneath the lamp. He had been a pawnshop owner for 30 years, long enough to know the difference between a woman selling something she no longer wanted and a woman selling something she was trying not to need. His eyes flicked once to Clara's face, then away, which she appreciated. Pity was easier to bear when it had manners. "This is real silver," he said. "Old work." Clara nodded. Her throat felt too tight for words, but she made herself answer because silence made people think they could decide things for you. "How much?" Jonah named a price. It was less than the ring was worth and more than Clara had expected. More importantly, it was exactly enough to cover the deed folded in her coat pocket, the one marked for a property no one else wanted, for miles beyond the old county road, where the pines thickened and the mail wagons stopped turning around after dusk. The Hollow Lantern Inn, the listing had said. 12 rooms, attached stable, cellar, damaged roof, sold as is. The broker had smiled when he said ruined, as if ruin were a joke that belonged to other people. Clara slid the ring toward Jonah before courage could leave her. The small scrape of silver against wood sounded louder than it should have. A week ago, she had still had a room in Silver Creek territory, a place at the long table, and a mate whose name people spoke with respect. Now Mason Graves had chosen a better alliance. His mother had made sure Clara's wages disappeared into invented debts, and every familiar doorway had become a place she was no longer welcome to stand. Clara signed Jonah's receipt with a hand that did not shake until after the ink dried. Then she took the bills, walked 3 blocks through the rain to the land office, and placed them on the clerk's desk beside the deed. The clerk, a narrow man with silver spectacles and ink on his cuff, read the property name without interest. Then he read hers. Clara Bennett. His pen stopped. For one strange second, all the ordinary sounds of the room seemed to move away from her, the rain, the clock, the shuffle of papers in the back office. The clerk looked at her name again, then at her face, and the color left him so quickly Clara wondered if he had suddenly become ill. "Is there a problem?" she asked. He swallowed, folded the deed toward her, and pushed the key across the desk as though he no longer wished to touch it. "No, Miss Bennett," he said, but his voice had changed. "No problem at all." 9 days earlier, Clara had learned that rejection could be spoken softly and still take the shape of a locked door. The council room at Silver Creek had smelled of rain-damp wool, polished oak, and the sharp herbal soap Lydia Graves insisted every servant use before entering any formal chamber. Clara remembered that detail more clearly than Mason's face, which felt strange, because once she had believed. She could read his face better than any book in the Pack library. He stood before the elders in his dark blue coat, his blonde hair combed back, his expression arranged into something that almost passed for sorrow if a person did not look at his eyes. Clara looked at his eyes. They were calm. That was the part she could not stop noticing. "I, Mason Graves, release Clara Bennett from the bond between us," he said, each word measured, respectful, clean. I do this for the future stability of Silver Creek and with no dishonor intended. No dishonor. The phrase settled somewhere behind Clara's ribs and stayed there, small and cold. Around the long table, the elders lowered their gazes in that careful way people used when they wanted to witness pain without becoming responsible for it. Brielle Carson sat beside Mason's mother, dressed in cream wool with a gold clasp at her throat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not smile. Clara almost respected her for that, until she noticed the slight lift of Brielle's chin, the quiet ownership already entering her posture, as though the room had shifted toward her before the ceremony was even finished. Mason waited for Clara to cry. She knew he did because his mouth softened in preparation for it, because his shoulders lowered a little, the way a man prepares to be generous in public. Clara gave him nothing to be generous about. She nodded once, folded her hands in front of her plain gray dress, and let the bond loosen inside her like a ribbon pulled through a closed fist. It hurt, but not in a way anyone in that room was allowed to see. When the elder asked if she accepted the dissolution, Clara heard her own voice answer, steady enough to surprise her. I heard him. Not I accept. Not I forgive. Only that. Mason blinked. Lydia's eyes narrowed by the width of a thread. Later, when the papers were signed and Clara had been dismissed as though her life were a meeting that had run long, she returned to the corridor outside the council room because she had forgotten her wool gloves on the bench. That was the reasonable explanation. That was the explanation she gave herself when she stopped at the half-closed door and heard Lydia's voice inside. She has 3 days in the East Room, no more. After that, the wages ledger will show what she owes. Mason sounded tired when he answered. She does not owe anything. She owes shelter, meals, formal clothing, and the healer visits after her wolf weakened. We can make the numbers support it. Brielle spoke next, smooth as cream poured over a blade. And the ring? Clara's hand moved to her pocket before she could stop it. The silver band was there, wrapped in a handkerchief, warm from her body. Let her keep it for a few days, Lydia said. Women like her sell sentiment before they sell pride. The room went quiet, and in that quiet Clara understood something more complete than betrayal. They were not only done with her. They had planned the shape of her absence. Her room would become Brielle's sewing chamber. Her name would disappear from the accounts. Her mother's little strip of orchard land, the one Clara had never been allowed to manage but had always been told was safely recorded, would be reassigned under a maintenance clause she had never seen. She has no family to contest it, Lydia added. No standing after the rejection, no strong wolf, no claim that matters. Clara stood very still in the corridor. The gloves lay on the bench 6 feet away, brown wool, one folded inside the other. She did not reach for them. Some things, she was beginning to understand, were left behind not because they had no value, but because taking them would mean pretending the room they came from was still yours. She walked away without making a sound, her hand closed around the ring in her pocket, and for the first time since Mason had spoken the words, she did not feel empty. She felt awake. By the time Clara reached the East Room, the house no longer sounded like a place she had lived in for 4 years. It sounded like furniture settling after guests had gone, like pipes clicking behind painted walls, like distant laughter that had learned to lower itself when she passed. Her room was not really a room anymore. Someone had already removed the second lamp from the writing table and the blue quilt from the bed, the one Mason had once said made. The space looked too cheerful for winter. The curtains were still there, thin white cotton moving faintly in the draft, and Clara stood in the doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame, waiting for grief to arrive in some shape she could recognize. It did not. What came instead was a quiet inventory. 2 wool dresses, 1 brown and 1 gray. 1 pair of good boots with the left heel beginning to loosen. 3 pairs of stockings. Her mother's small bone-handled knife, dull from years of cutting twine and apple peels. A notebook with pressed leaves between the pages. The rejection paper, folded once by the elder and then folded twice more by Clara because she did not like the way Mason's signature took up so much space. And the ring. She placed everything on the bed in careful rows, as though preparing for inspection, and saw at once how little of a life could fit inside a single canvas satchel. The wardrobe still held the green dress Mason had bought for the harvest dinner last year, the one Lydia said made Clara look almost presentable. Clara left it hanging. On the vanity sat a pearl comb Brielle had admired 3 weeks earlier with a smile that asked without asking. Clara left that too. There was a silver-framed mirror on the wall, a winter cloak with a fur collar, 2 pairs of gloves softer than anything she had owned as a girl, and a little bottle of rosewater Mason had brought back from Denver after a council trip. None of it went into the satchel. They had given those things to the version of her that smiled too quickly, apologized too often, and believed gratitude could be a form of safety. That woman had not survived the hallway outside the council room. Clara changed into her oldest dress, the gray one with mended cuffs, and tied her hair at the nape of her neck with a plain ribbon. Then she took the pack ribbon from her wrist. Silver Creek blue, braided with a narrow line of white thread. She had worn it every day since the bonding announcement, through spring rain and summer heat and the first frost. The skin beneath it looked pale and soft, almost startled. She carried it downstairs just after sunset, when most of the house had moved toward dinner and the halls smelled of roasted carrots, warm bread, and the rosemary chicken she used to help prepare on Sundays before Lydia decided future Lunas did not belong near kitchens. Mason was standing near the entry table with Brielle beside him. Of course he was. Men like Mason always seemed to appear in doorways when leaving needed an audience. Clara, he said, and his voice held that careful gentleness again, the one he used when he wanted witnesses to think well of him. You do not have to rush out tonight. Clara placed the blue ribbon on the polished table between them. Not thrown. Not dropped. Placed. I know, she said. That is why I am choosing to. Brielle's eyes moved to the satchel. Lydia, entering from the side hall, noticed the plainness of it and smiled as though poverty had confirmed something she had always known. Clara let her smile. She did not owe Lydia the satisfaction of flinching. Outside, the air smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke, and the gravel drive stretched a quarter mile to the county road. Clara walked it without looking back. Only when the house lights had blurred behind the trees did she stop beneath an old maple and open her hand around the ring. Moonlight slid over the silver band, catching on the engraving inside. A lantern beneath a crescent moon. She rubbed her thumb over the tiny mark and felt, impossibly, a faint warmth answer from the metal, not enough to frighten her, only enough to make her breathing slow. Her wolf, silent since the rejection, stirred once inside her chest like an animal lifting its head in the dark. Clara closed her fingers around the ring and kept walking. 3 days after Clara left Silver Creek, she stood at the end of an old county road with the deed in her coat pocket, the key in her palm, and the uneasy feeling that the inn had been waiting longer than any building should know how to wait. The rain had stopped sometime before noon, but the world still held the dampness of it. Water clung to the pine needles overhead. Mud pulled gently at the soles of her boots. The late afternoon air smelled of wet bark, cold earth, and the faint sweetness of apples rotting somewhere beyond the tree line. Clara had paid a farmer $2 to bring her as far as the broken mile marker, and he had looked at the road ahead with the expression of a man deciding whether warning a stranger counted as kindness. Nobody stays there, he had said, not unkindly. Clara had thanked him anyway. She had learned that people often said nobody when what they meant was nobody with a choice. The hollow lantern inn appeared slowly, not all at once, but in pieces between the trees, first the sagging roofline, then the dark square of a boarded window, then the crooked sign hanging from one rusted chain above the porch. The painted lantern on the sign had faded to a ghost of yellow. The crescent moon above it was almost gone, worn thin by weather and years of being ignored. Still, Clara saw it. Her fingers tightened around the key before she remembered the ring was no longer there to press against her skin. The inn sat in a shallow dip beside the road, 2 stories of gray wood and fieldstone, wider than she had expected and sadder than the listing had admitted. The porch leaned slightly to the left. One shutter hung loose, tapping softly whenever the wind moved. Ivy had climbed the west wall and reached the chimney, wrapping the brick in green so dark it looked almost black. The stable behind the main building had one door missing and a roof patched with tin sheets that flashed dull silver under the clouds. It should have looked dead. Instead, it looked asleep in a way that made Clara lower her voice, though she had not spoken. The front steps complained beneath her weight, but they held. The door took effort. Not because it was locked too tightly, but because the wood had swollen with years of rain and disuse. When it finally opened, the sound that came out was long and low, like the building had been holding its breath since the last person left. Clara stepped inside and stopped. The air was colder than outside. It smelled of dust, old cider, chimney soot, and something faintly herbal buried beneath the decay. A cracked front desk stood to her right, its brass bell clouded green. Beyond it stretched a common room with tables pushed against the walls, chairs stacked unevenly, and a stone fireplace large enough for a man to stand inside. 12 doors lined the hall beyond, all closed. There was no welcome, no warmth, no voice calling from a kitchen, no mason pretending to be gentle, no Lydia measuring her worth by the quality of her dress. Clara had bought silence. For one strange moment, the silence felt almost like mercy. Then the floor above her creaked. Clara looked up. Dust drifted from the ceiling in a thin gray veil. She told herself it was the wind shifting through loose boards. She told herself old buildings made old sounds. She set her satchel on the counter and took one slow breath. The key, no longer needed, left a dark imprint in her damp palm. She walked through the common room, touching nothing at first, only looking. A cracked mug on the mantel. A faded receipt pinned behind the desk. A moth-eaten curtain moving in a window that had been nailed shut. Near the back wall, half hidden by an overturned bench, was a narrow door with 3 boards hammered across it. The cellar, she thought. She did not know why the word seemed to arrive before she reached it. That was when the sound came from beneath the floor. 3 knocks. Slow. Clear. Patient. Clara stood in the ruined inn she had paid for with the last piece of her mother's memory, and every small hair along the back of her neck lifted as the cellar knocked again. Clara did not open the cellar door that night. There were brave women in stories who walked toward every strange sound with a candle in one hand and destiny waiting beneath the stairs, but Clara had spent the last week learning the difference between courage and exhaustion. Exhaustion made poor decisions and called them necessary. So she stood very still until the knocking stopped, counted 10 slow breaths, and then dragged the overturned bench in front of the boarded door with both hands. The wood scraped across the floor in a long, complaining groan that echoed through the common room and made the inn feel larger than it had a moment before. "Not tonight," she said, and her voice came out thin but present. That was enough. Outside, the last light drained from the windows, turning each boarded pane into a dull black mirror. Clara found a broom behind the front desk with more cobweb than straw, a dented coal bucket beside the hearth, and 3 logs stacked in a corner as if someone had meant to come back for winter and simply never had. The fireplace was full of cold ash. When she knelt to clear it, soot marked the cuffs of her gray dress and settled under her fingernails. She almost laughed at that, not because anything was funny, but because Lydia Graves had once told her that a woman showed her breathing through her hands. Clara looked down at hers now, dirty, trembling, still capable of work, and decided they had never looked more honest. It took her 20 minutes to find matches. They were tucked inside the front desk drawer beneath a stack of water-warped menus, wrapped in oilcloth and blessedly dry. Under them was a small tin of tea leaves gone faint with age and a black iron kettle with one crooked handle. The first match broke. The second went out. The third caught, and Clara leaned close to shelter the tiny flame as if it were something alive and frightened. When the kindling finally accepted it, when the first thin line of smoke rose and the smallest orange light opened inside the hearth, Clara felt a sound move through her chest that was almost pain and almost relief. She sat back on her heels and watched the fire decide to stay. It did not fix the roof. It did not return the ring. It did not make the rejection paper any less real inside her satchel. But it made one circle of warmth in a room that had been cold for years, and for that moment, one circle was enough. Later, she found the blanket in a cupboard behind the bar, folded around a lavender sachet so old it should have lost its scent but had not. She shook it out carefully, expecting dust, and instead released the faint smell of summer fields, clean linen, and someone who had once believed guests deserved comfort. That was when the chair beneath her finally gave way. It did not collapse dramatically. One leg simply surrendered, and Clara sank to the floor with the blanket in her arms. For a second she stared at the broken chair, and then the tears came, quiet and unwelcome, slipping down her face. Without asking permission. She did not sob. She did not press her hands to her mouth. She only sat against the cold front of the bar with the lavender blanket over her knees and let the room blur until the fire became a soft orange shape across the floor. She had left without begging. She had signed the deed. She had crossed 4 miles of wet road with everything she owned on her shoulder. Still, here in the hollow of the ruined inn, the truth arrived with no ceremony. She was alone. A small sound came from the staircase. Clara lifted her head. 2 pale green eyes looked down at her from the 5th step. The cat was gray, thin as a shadow, with 1 torn ear and the offended dignity of a creature that had survived too much to be impressed by anyone. It studied Clara, then the fire, then the boarded cellar door. "I suppose you live here," Clara whispered. The cat came down 1 step, then another, silent except for the soft click of claws on old wood. It did not approach the hearth. It crossed the common room and sat directly in front of the cellar door, tail wrapped around its paws, facing the boards like a guard on duty. Clara wiped her cheeks with the edge of the blanket. The fire popped once, bright and sudden. Beneath the floor, something answered with 1 patient knock. By morning, Clara had decided that fear was easier to carry in daylight, even if daylight entered the inn in thin gray strips through cracked boards and dirty glass. She had slept in pieces, waking each time the fire shifted, each time the wind worried at the loose shutter, each time the gray cat opened one eye from its place before the cellar door as though measuring whether Clara had become sensible yet. The knocking had not returned after that single answer beneath the floor, which made it worse in a quiet way. Repeated sounds could be blamed on pipes, animals, weather, imagination. 1 patient knock felt like a message. Clara made tea from the old leaves because warm water pretending to be tea was still better than cold courage. She drank it standing beside the hearth, then found the bone-handled knife in her satchel and the rusted claw hammer tucked beneath the front desk. The cat watched her cross the room. "You could help," Clara told it. The cat blinked slowly, which Clara accepted as refusal. The boards over the cellar door were old pine, gray at the edges and swollen around the nails. Whoever had sealed it had not done so neatly. They had worked fast, crossing 1 board over another in a rough pattern that looked less like repair and more like warning. Clara wedged the hammer beneath the first board and pulled. The nail screamed out of the wood, sharp and sudden. Dust fell across her sleeves. The second nail took longer. The third came free so quickly she stumbled back against the overturned bench, heart kicking hard, knife still closed in her other hand. Nothing rushed out. No hand reached from the dark. No voice called her name. Only the smell arrived, cool and deep, carrying stone, old apples, dried herbs, and the mineral dampness of earth that had not seen the sun in years. When the last board came loose, the door sagged inward 1/2 an inch, as though relieved. Clara lifted the iron latch. It was cold enough to sting. The stairs beyond were narrow, cut from stone, descending farther than any ordinary inn cellar should have needed. She lit a candle from the hearth and held it low. The flame leaned toward the dark. The cat slipped past her feet and started down first, tail high, entirely unimpressed by mysteries that had clearly belonged to it long before Clara arrived. "Of course," Clara whispered, and followed. Each step lowered the sound of the world above her. By the time she reached the bottom, the inn had become a memory overhead. The cellar opened into a long stone chamber lined with empty wine racks and shelves bowed under dust. But it did not end there. An arched passage continued beyond the first room, its walls fitted with iron lantern hooks shaped like crescent moons. Clara raised the candle. On the nearest crate, beneath a skin of dust, someone had burned a mark into the wood, a lantern cradled under a crescent. The same mark that had been inside her mother's ring. The candle trembled in Clara's hand, though there was no draught. Her wolf, silent and bruised since the rejection, stirred once beneath her ribs. Not strongly. Not the full bright presence she remembered from before Mason spoke his careful words. Just a breath, a lift of the head, a small living warmth turning towards something it recognized. Clara pressed her free hand to her chest. "You feel that too," she said softly. The cat gave a quiet sound from the far side of the chamber, where a heavy canvas sheet hung over something tall. Clara crossed to it slowly, passing 3 more crates, a locked iron box, and a rolled map sealed with black wax. The sheet came away in a dry whisper. Behind it was a portrait. A woman stood beside the very fireplace upstairs, one hand resting on the front desk, her pale hair braided over one shoulder, her eyes steady in a face Clara knew too well because it looked like an older, stronger version of her own. Beneath the frame, in faded gold lettering, were the words Elise Bennett, keeper of the Lantern Sanctuary. Clara stood in the hidden cellar with dust on her dress, a candle in her hand, and her family name shining back at her from a past no one had told her she owned. Clara did not move for a long time. The candle burned lower in her hand, sending a thin line of wax over her knuckle, but even that small sting felt far away compared to the face in the portrait. Elise Bennett had Clara's eyes, or Clara had hers, which seemed stranger and somehow more painful. The woman in the painting did not look grand in the way Brielle tried to look grand, with her chin lifted and her hands arranged as though the world were a room she had already been promised. Elise wore a plain dark dress, a white apron tied at her waist, and a ring on her left hand, silver and narrow, painted with such care that Clara could see the tiny lantern beneath the crescent moon. Not jewelry, then. Not sentiment. A key. The word arrived inside her with a certainty that made her wolf stir again, faint but unmistakable, like warm breath against a closed door. Clara set the candle on an overturned barrel and reached for the locked iron box beside the map. Its surface was dull with age, but the symbol on the lid had been polished by hands long gone. She pressed her thumb over it, uselessly. At first, then remembered the ring was no longer on her finger, no longer in her pocket, no longer hers in any practical sense. The loss moved through her so cleanly she almost sat down. Instead she opened the rolled map because maps, unlike grief, sometimes gave a person somewhere to go. The parchment cracked softly under her fingers. It showed the inn at the center of a web of lines reaching beneath the old county road, through the eastern ridge, under Silver Creek boundary stones, and toward North Haven territory. Not tunnels for escape alone. Routes. Shelter paths. Hidden rooms marked with small lanterns. A kitchen cellar large enough for winter stores. A healer's chamber. 3 safe sleeping rooms. A well under the north wall. Names had been written beside certain passages in careful brown ink. Children moved during the winter fever, widows from Pine Hollow, unclaimed Omega twins, healer convoy, Mercer protection granted. Clara's breath caught on that last word. Mercer. She unrolled the parchment farther and found a folded packet tied with faded blue thread. The first page was not a letter but a charter, stamped with 3 seals, the lantern and crescent, a wolf crown, and a black pine she did not recognize. The language was formal, but its meaning was clear enough to make the cellar feel suddenly warmer. The hollow lantern was not ordinary property. It had been recognized as neutral sanctuary land by the Alpha Kings of North Haven nearly 80 years ago, protected from seizure, debt claim, marriage transfer, or pack punishment. Its keeper was to be chosen by bloodline or lawful appointment. Its records were to remain sealed until a Bennett heir returned. Clara read the words twice, then a third time because the first 2 felt too large to trust. A Bennett heir. Not a charity case. Not a rejected woman with no standing. Not the quiet girl Lydia Graves had planned to erase with ledgers and soft voices behind doors. Clara Bennett. The name inside her became heavier, not like a burden, but like a stone placed at the bottom of a river to show where the current had always been. Beneath the charter was an older account ledger. Page after page listed supplies. Room repairs, births, healings, safe arrivals, names protected by initials, and payments received from North Haven for keeping the roads open during hard winters. Then the entries changed. 23 years ago, Elise Bennett signed fewer pages. Another hand appeared beside hers. Lydia Vale, witness. Clara went still. Vale had been Lydia Graves' maiden name. The next entries became thinner, colder, full of transfers and maintenance claims and boundary disputes. A final page, dated the year Clara was born, declared the inn abandoned, its keeper deceased, its surviving family line unverified. The witness signature was the same. Lydia Vale Graves. Clara sat back on her heels. Above her, the ruined inn creaked softly in the wind. Below her hand, the charter waited with patient authority. At the very bottom, beneath the old seals, one sentence had been added in darker ink: if the keeper's blood returns and the lantern fails to open, send word to North Haven. It was signed Alaric Mercer, Crown Alpha of the Northern Territories. Clara touched the name, and the cellar seemed to answer with a quiet pulse of silver light from the locked box. Clara had just carried the charter upstairs when the first carriage wheels sounded on the wet road. At first she thought the noise belonged to memory, because the inn had so many old sounds inside it that the present seemed to move carefully among them, afraid of disturbing what had been left behind. Then the gray cat lifted its head from the front desk, ears turning toward the windows, and Clara knew. Visitors did not come to ruined inns by accident. She folded the charter once, then stopped herself. Old paper did not like fear. She laid it flat between two pages of the ledger, slid the map beneath her coat, and placed the deed on the counter where the morning light touched her name. Her hands were dirty from the cellar, her dress smelled faintly of smoke and stone, and there was dust along one cheek she had not noticed until she saw her reflection in the clouded glass behind the bar. She almost wiped it away. Then she did not. Let them see she had been working. Let them see she had gone below what they thought she was allowed to. No. The carriage stopped outside. A second later, another horse drew up behind it. Clara heard Mason's voice before she saw him, low and irritated, followed by Lydia's smoother murmur and the soft crunch of Brielle's boots on gravel. They entered without knocking. That, more than anything, told Clara what they believed this place was. Not hers. Not yet. Not possibly. Mason stepped into the common room in a dark traveling coat, his eyes moving over the cracked tables, the repaired fire, the blanket folded by the hearth, and finally Clara herself. Something like relief passed through his face when he saw the ruin, as if the building had confirmed she remained beneath concern. Lydia came in behind him wearing black gloves and a gray cloak pinned with the Silver Creek crest. Brielle followed last, careful not to let her hem touch the floorboards, her expression composed in the way women became composed when they had rehearsed contempt in a mirror. "Clara," Mason said. "We came as soon as we heard." Clara rested one hand on the counter beside the deed. "That must have been a difficult ride, considering no one told you where I was going." His mouth tightened. Lydia answered for him. "Property records are public when they concern disputed territory." The word disputed entered the room dressed as law, but Clara had spent the morning in a cellar full of older words. Protected. Neutral. Keeper. Bennett. "It is not disputed on my deed," she said. Brielle glanced toward the hallway, then the boarded cellar door, now open behind Clara. The color in her face changed by a fraction, not enough for Mason to notice, but enough for Lydia to notice Brielle noticing. Lydia removed one glove finger by finger. "You are tired. You have made an emotional decision with money you could not afford to lose. This inn has unpaid maintenance claims attached to it, and Silver Creek has long managed the boundary interests. Sign it back under PAC administration, and we can prevent further embarrassment." Clara looked at the paper Lydia placed on the counter. A transfer form. Already prepared. Her name written in a clerk's hand. A blank line waiting for her surrender. "You brought this with you." Out of concern, Clara said. Mason stepped closer, gentle face restored. "You were never meant to manage property, Clara. Let someone stronger handle it before you get hurt by debts you do not understand. There it was again, the soft cage. Not bars, not chains, only concern arranged so tightly a woman could lose her life inside it. Clara opened the ledger to the page with Lydia Vale's signature and turned it around. Lydia went still. For the first time since Clara had known her, Mason's mother looked not angry, but caught between two locked doors. Brielle moved toward the cellar stairs. "What else did you find?" she asked too quickly. Clara picked up the deed before Mason's hand could cover it. "Enough to know you should have knocked." The silence after that was not empty. It filled with the fire settling, the cat's tail tapping once against the desk, the faint drip of rainwater from the porch roof. Then a new sound reached them from outside, hooves slowing in the yard, several riders, not Silver Creek by the rhythm or the weight. Lydia turned first. Through the broken front window, Clara saw black cloaks edged in silver and one rider dismounting before the others had fully stopped. Mason lost all color. Brielle stepped back from the cellar door. The man who entered did not hurry, yet the whole room seemed to make space before he crossed the threshold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his coat marked with a silver wolf crown over the heart. His eyes moved once over Mason, once over Lydia, and then came to Clara, not dismissing the dust on her dress or the deed in her hand. "Clara Bennett?" he asked. His voice was calm enough to quiet the fire. Clara lifted her chin. "Yes." The man inclined his head, not deeply, but with unmistakable respect. "Rowan Mercer," he said. "I received word that the lantern had answered." Rowan Mercer did not look like the men Clara had known how to disappoint. He did not fill the room with noise, did not raise his voice, did not need Mason to step aside before Mason did it. The stepping aside happened anyway. Lydia lowered her eyes by instinct and seemed to resent herself for it. Brielle moved away from the cellar door as though the shadows below had suddenly become witnesses. Rowan removed his black gloves with unhurried precision and placed them on the front desk beside the brass bell, then turned his attention fully to Clara. Not to the transfer paper. Not to Mason. Not even to the Silver Creek crest at Lydia's throat. To Clara. "Is this property yours?" he asked. The question was simple, but it changed the shape of the room. Mason drew in a breath as if preparing to answer for her. Rowan's gaze shifted once, not sharply, only enough. Mason closed his mouth. Clara felt something inside her loosen, not because Rowan had saved her, but because he had made space for her voice without touching it. She placed the deed on the counter first. "This was registered in my name yesterday at the county land office." Then the ledger. "This was found in the cellar under the inn, along with a charter naming the property neutral sanctuary land under North Haven protection." She unfolded the map carefully, smoothing one curled edge with her palm. The tunnels crossed beneath Silver Creek boundaries. The records show they were used with permission from North Haven before the inn was declared abandoned. Rowan listened without interruption. That should not have felt remarkable. It did. Men in council rooms had always listened to Clara as though waiting for the useful part to end. Rowan listened as though every word arrived with weight already attached. He examined the deed, then the charter, then the ledger page marked by Lydia Vale's signature. His face did not change, but the room became colder around his stillness. "Mrs. Graves," he said, "this is your maiden signature." Lydia's chin lifted. "I signed many administrative documents for old boundary properties. I cannot be expected to remember every neglected building." Clara opened the ledger to the final page and turned it toward Rowan. "This one declared my family line unverified the year I was born." Rowan read it. Then he looked at Clara again. "You are Elise Bennett's descendant?" The name moved through Clara like a door opening. "I believe so." "The lantern mark answered to you?" Clara hesitated. "The locked box answered. It lit when I touched the charter. But I cannot open it. The ring that matches the mark was my mother's. I sold it before I knew what it was." Mason made a small sound, almost relieved. "Then there is no proof of keeper claim." Rowan did not look at him. There is already proof. The ring is confirmation, not permission. Clara held very still. No one had ever explained law to her in a way that gave something back. Rowan turned to one of the writers at the door. Send for Jonah Reed on Marrow Street. Bring him here with the item purchased from Miss Bennet, if he still possesses it. The writer left at once. The waiting that followed was not empty. Lydia stood near the hearth with her lips pressed pale. Brielle stared at the cellar entrance. Mason watched Clara as though trying to find the frightened woman he had known and discovering only the outline of where she used to stand. Jonah arrived less than an hour later in a rain-dark coat, breathing hard from the ride, with a small velvet pouch held in both hands. I did not melt it, he said before anyone asked. I saw the mark. My grandfather told stories about that mark. I locked it away. He gave the pouch to Clara, not Rowan. That mattered too. Clara opened it and tipped the ring into her palm. The silver looked smaller than memory and heavier than law. Her finger had missed it before her mind allowed the truth. She slid it back into place. The fit was perfect. The cellar below gave one soft knock, not frightening this time, almost welcoming. Rowan's eyes moved to the open door. Miss Bennet, he said, the box is waiting for you. Clara walked down the stairs with the others behind her, though none of them came too close. The iron box sat where she had left it, dull and sealed, the lantern and crescent waiting on its lid. Clara placed her ringed hand over the mark. For one breath, nothing happened. Then silver light ran through the grooves in the iron, down the sides of the box, across the stone floor, and into the old lantern hooks along the walls. One by one, the hidden lanterns woke, filling the cellar with a gentle moonlit glow. Clara heard Lydia whisper something behind her, but it no longer mattered. The box opened beneath Clara's hand. Inside the iron box was not treasure in the way Clara had once imagined treasure as a girl. There were no jewels spilling over velvet, no gold stacked high enough to make Lydia Graves forget how to breathe. There were papers, keys, wax seals, a black leather registry, and a folded banner so old its cream fabric had darkened at the edges. Rowan lifted nothing until Clara did. That became the first rule of the room, though no one said it aloud. Clara took the registry with both hands and opened it beneath the silver lantern light. Names filled the pages in careful columns, not only Bennet's, but dozens of families who had passed through the sanctuary when they had nowhere else to go. Omegas without claims. Children sent ahead of winter storms. Healers carrying medicine across dangerous roads. Widows who needed 3 nights without questions. Beside each entry was a mark of protection, and again, the same signature appeared from North Haven, Mercer approval granted. Rowan stood beside her, close enough for his presence to steady the air, never close enough to crowd her. This registry is active, he said quietly. It was never lawfully closed. By sundown, riders had gone to Silver Creek, the county land office, and 3 neighboring packs. By the next morning, the common room of the inn held more witnesses than Clara had chairs for. Elders stood along the walls. The county clerk with the silver spectacles kept his eyes on the floor. Jonah Reed sat near the hearth with the gray cat beside his boot as if the cat had appointed itself judge. Mason came in pale and silent. Lydia entered last, dressed perfectly, which made the fear around her mouth easier to see. Brielle stood beside her, no longer wearing the expression of a woman certain the room would choose her. Rowan did not sit at the head of the room. He placed the charter on the front desk and stood to Clara's right, leaving the space behind the desk to her. That was where Elise Bennet had stood in the portrait. That was where Clara stood now. The evidence did not need shouting. It only needed to be read. The charter recognized the hollow lantern as neutral sanctuary. Land. The ledger showed Lydia Vale Graves had witnessed the false abandonment. The county records showed Clara's mother had tried twice to verify the Bennet line and had been refused by Silver Creek administration. The tunnel maps showed years of hidden use beneath pack boundaries, not for shelter, but for private storage and quiet transfers that had never been reported to North Haven. With every page, Mason seemed to shrink inside his fine coat. Lydia's face hardened, then emptied. Clara thought she would feel triumph when the room finally understood. Instead, she felt something steadier and older. Relief, perhaps. Or the beginning of belonging. Rowan's judgment was calm. Silver Creek's claim was suspended. The Bennett property was restored. Lydia Graves and the officials who supported the false records would answer to North Haven Review. Mason's rejection would stand, not as Clara's shame, but as the legal severing that prevented him from claiming any part of what had returned to her. Brielle said nothing, and for once, her silence did not feel elegant. It felt small. When Rowan asked what Clara wished done with the inn, every face turned toward her. A week earlier, that much attention would have made her fold herself smaller. Now she looked toward the cellar door, the repaired fire, the gray cat washing one paw on the hearth, and the old banner waiting on the desk. "Open it," she said. Her voice did not tremble. Not as a pack house. Not as Silver Creek property. As sanctuary. 3 weeks later, the broken sign came down. Jonah helped hang the restored one while Clara steadied the ladder and pretended not to notice Rowan watching from the road with the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. The hollow lantern glowed again by evening, real lanterns in every window, warm bread in the kitchen, clean blankets stacked in the rooms upstairs, and the cellar opened beneath the house like a heart that had finally remembered its purpose. Clara kept the ring on her finger, but she no longer touched it as if it were the last thing left of her mother. It was not the end of anything. It was a key, a witness, a promise carried through years of silence until it found her. Hand again. That night, when the first traveler knocked on the door, Clara opened it herself. Behind her, the fire burned steady. Beside her, Rowan Mercer waited without stepping in front of her. And outside the gate, far beyond the lantern light, the people who had once called her nothing stood in the dark and watched her name become a home.